Welcome everyone to this 7th of March edition of Geopolitics Upside Down podcast, part of a series within the Burning Archive podcast. And this is a podcast which is about the situation in Ukraine and I guess the looming Atlantic versus World Island World War. In the last episode, I gave a bit of an overview of my assessment of the situation, did a sort of a background episode, a special episode on the Ukraine crisis, which really described this as like the last phase of 100 years Cold War, very much provoked, I guess, by the eastward expansion of NATO, as well as a whole lot of more specific factors around Ukraine and Russia. In the previous episode, I sort of set out 4 vectors to sort of keep track of the situation, which I'll kind of follow through on these episodes, which I'm aiming to do twice a week. And those 4 vectors are kind of the military situation, the information war, cultural war, and the economic war, which is perhaps the major feature of this war at this point of time, and then the diplomatic war. And I gave a quick overview of the first 3 of those things, and today I want to look in a little bit more detail about the diplomatic war and really, I guess, the rhetoric that in the West, Anglo-American world, liberal democratic world, we read in our sort of press, and all the rest of it is the world is united behind Ukraine and outrage. We want to turn Russia into a pariah state. And I guess my overview of the diplomatic war is that maybe the intention from the sort of American-led NATO coalition, but it does not really seem to be coming to pass. And this is very much going to be a struggle for the nature and form and dynamics of a new world order, the emergence perhaps of a bifurcated world or perhaps of a multipolar world. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the diplomatic war, and I kind of want to sort of review the chessboard, so to speak, particularly the non-American, non-NATO chessboard, given that I guess this podcast is really aimed at the general audience who may not be following events all that closely, largely relying on the media, but might be interested in a broader perspective informed both by history and reading other perspectives that I hope to bring on this podcast. So I'm going to sort of focus in a little bit on China, India, and the Gulf states, and where they've been positioning themselves and what a sort of overview of them indicates about the whole diplomatic situation. But first, let's just do a quick kind of situation report. Clearly, events are unfolding very dramatically over there in Ukraine, and quite tragically, and not just in Ukraine now, because the collateral damage from the economic war that has largely been launched by America and Europe and, to my shame, Australia against Russia is starting to have a impact on Russians, but it's also actually having a dramatic impact on the citizens of those countries, and especially the citizens of the poorer regions of the world. If you've been to buy some petrol lately, I think it's around about 200 cents a litre at the moment. It might have gone over that mark today, and certainly I can see on the sort of commodity trading pages that, crude oil has gone up 8 to 10% in price today. Gasoline has gone up 7.6%. Heating oil has gone up 8.74%. And wheat, main ingredient for flour and food for many people, has gone up 6.88%. Coal has also gone up 13.18%. So the situation is that in terms of the military situation, approximately 40% of Ukrainian territory is now clearly under Russian control. It's estimated that three quarters of its military installations have been destroyed. All its major airports have been destroyed. There's complete air domination for Russia. And just in the last day or so, I think they've bombed the major airfield that's close to Poland. It was a potential base for jets supplied by America and Poland to enforce a no-fly zone. The Ukrainian Navy has been destroyed, and the Kiev and the major cities in the south are encircled, and there's a major battle going on around Kharkiv. The analyst, the Saker, who's a sort of a legendary analyst of Russian affairs, basically has commented that the West has lost the war in the Ukraine, but it needs two things: as many dead on all sides as possible, and to make the most political capital possible from this war, which means that not only must it last as long as possible, but it has to deliver the biggest number of deaths, maimed and injured. The only rational decision at this point is for the Ukrainians to surrender, but as yet that is not what they're doing. I believe there are going to be further negotiations between Ukraine and Russia tomorrow, so overnight Australian time. There have been, in the last couple of days, a number of ceasefire efforts to create humanitarian corridors around cities like Mariupol and I believe also Kharkiv, and those humanitarian corridors are to allow civilians to leave safely, and also to allow any Ukrainian soldiers who want to sort of lay down their weapons and leave peacefully to also leave. However, there are mixed reports about breaking the ceasefire, but it would appear that the Ukrainian side has been breaking the ceasefire, in particular around Mariupol, where the extreme nationalist Azov battalion is strongly entrenched. And there's a really major humanitarian crisis, I guess, emerging there, with lack of water, lack of food, and very desperate people wanting to get away, and effectively being, held hostage by the Ukrainian military forces. One can only hope that that situation is sort of resolved. And to be honest, I really do think, despite all the talk about Ukrainian resistance bravely standing up to the Russians, I do think it would be the best interest of all the people if the Zelensky regime surrendered and allowed those cities to be sort of handed over without sort of street-to-street combat and consequent massive civilian and other casualties. And I guess the other thing is there's been enormous news in the last couple of days about incidents at nuclear facilities, a number of claims by the Ukrainian government about those incidents have proven to be false. And there are now claims by the Russian government that there was a plan to do a kind of a false flag nuclear attack at one of those facilities. Clearly we're in fog of war state. I should also add to that there's extremely active diplomacy from particularly India, but also China, around evacuating large numbers of Indian and Chinese and African students from the big cities that are surrounded by the troops, like Kharkiv. All sorts of claims and counterclaims of biolabs, nuclear programs, shelling of nuclear facilities, tortures, increasing evidence spilling out around the extreme nationalist, I'm going to call them, Ukrainian forces. One of the diplomatic negotiators for Ukraine, who was pictured meeting with the Russian-Ukrainian people, was apparently shot for treason by his own side. There's also many reports about emerging around noting that there is conscription of all men aged 18 to 60 in Ukraine. There are many reports emerging of people being shot if they try to abandon the cities. Pretty, saw the horror and tragedy of war. Totally awful. And similarly, the economic situation is, I think there's growing recognition of potential chain reaction and unintended consequences of the sanctions that have been applied, but I might get to that more in a later episode. Okay, so that's the situation report. What I want to do now is have a little look at the sort of diplomatic positions of three important states or regions: India, China, and the Gulf states. The Gulf states partly interesting because the United Arab Emirates is currently the chair of the UN Security Council. And the Gulf states, of course, produce a lot of oil and have traditionally been closely allied with America, so some of their diplomatic positioning during this crisis is quite interesting. As I said at the start, the general rhetoric in the media of the West, and the rhetoric coming from people like Boris Johnson, Joe Biden, Anthony Blinken, Scott Morrison is, the world is united against an axis of evil, and, Russia is being turned into a pariah state. Is that true? Okay, let's look at India first. So India has abstained from all the votes at the UN Security Council and at the UN General Assembly condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This has caused quite a bit of angst in the West, and including in my home country of Australia. I think last Friday, the front page of the Australian had a great big headline, which was, occurring on the same day as a meeting of the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue between India, China, America, and the United States of America and Australia. The headline was all about effectively pressuring India to be more hostile or to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But throughout the entire period, really since Russia put its requests for legally guaranteed security guarantees on the table in December, India has consistently called for an approach of quiet diplomacy, an approach that recognises Russia's legitimate security interests, and an approach that sort of will be based in international law rather than the American concept of the international rules-based order. India is a very close and long-standing ally of Russia. It gets its military supplies from Russia and does a lot of trade with Russia, and has a long-standing diplomatic tradition of being one of the leaders of the non-aligned world back in the sort of Cold War era, and in a way is continuing to do that. In addition, India has consistently through the whole process been expressing concern about the fate of the very large number in the tens of thousands of Indian students who are actually in the conflict zone of Ukraine at the moment, and currently is very focused on working with Russia rather than against Russia to organise the safe evacuation of those students, not just Indian students, also Chinese students and African students, through humanitarian corridors. And it appears to be quite successful in doing so. Narendra Modi, the president of India, has had a number of, president or prime minister, I'm not quite sure, has had a number of quite successful phone calls with Vladimir Putin to that effect in recent times. India is definitely not in the NATO camp, and this is driving the Western diplomats and political leaders nuts. So on Thursday last week, or Friday last week, there was a meeting of the Quad leaders, like a phone type meeting, Quad leaders. So President Joe Biden briefed the Quad leaders on the situation in Ukraine. And although India wanted to talk about other things, there was some discussion of the Ukraine situation, which had been put off at previous Quad meetings quite meticulously by India, of this sort of issue. And there had also even been talk of sanctions against India, which is probably going to backfire. So there's a very interesting article, which I won't go into too much detail, by the former Indian ambassador M.K. Bhadrakumar, who writes a blog called Indian Punchline, which is wonderful insight into Indian thinking on the situations, the sort of new world order, let's say, where he says, referring to the Quad meeting, that evidently Biden called this unscheduled meeting with a one-point agenda: Delhi's hesitancy to identify with Washington in regard of the Ukraine issue. Biden was determined to discipline the laggard. Indian diplomacy has reached a T-junction. The American strategy to precipitate an epochal confrontation with Russia over Ukraine's NATO membership is anchored in Washington's quest for a world order for the 21st century which it can dominate. Thus, Russia's operations are born out of its existential concerns over national security. None of these issues concern Quad even remotely, and Indeed, Modi even underlined that the Quad must remain focused on its core objective of promoting peace, stability and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific region. But the US persisted nonetheless. So it's actually, M.K. Bhadrakumar says here, the time has come to review India's association with the Quad. The disdalliance has not brought India any dividends, and he basically says Russia is vastly more important to India as a long-term strategic partner than Australia, Japan, or indeed perhaps the United States. So if the world's united against Ukraine, you can count India out, and that's 1.4 billion people. And then there's Pakistan, which is also not aligned with the US as well. And Pakistan is nearly, it's 228 million people. If you get a chance, do check out the clips of the Indian Foreign Minister, Subramanyam Jaishankar, at the Munich Security Dialogue shortly before the commencement of the military operation in Ukraine. And he is an absolute class act, and he's asked some very coercive leading questions by the Western journalist or television presenter, and he handles them absolutely masterfully. So he's a total star act, and I think India is in good hands. Spent a bit of time on India because I think it's a really crucial case study. What about China? Again, I think just in the last 24 hours, the Prime Minister of Australia has expressed the view that China needs to get on board with America and NATO and sort of sanction Russia. And a day or so ago, as reported in the Global Times on March the 5th, so maybe 2 days ago, the Chinese Foreign Minister had a conversation at the request of the American Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken. So Anthony Blinken in this case was the supplicant to China. And essentially Anthony Blinken was putting the same view that China needs to get on board and treat Russia as a pariah state, and, wouldn't it be better if they partnered up with America and isolated Russia and carved it up. But the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi said that the Ukraine crisis can only be solved through dialogue and negotiations, and stressed that all efforts to help ease tensions and push for a political solution, and opposes all actions that are not conducive to diplomatic resolution but add fuel to the fire, e.g. sanctions or indulging in ideas about partisan warfare and heroic resistance. So really, China has consistently rebuffed these efforts, and that reflects the broad, very significant partnership arrangement, I guess, or alliance that China and Russia have. And sometimes people will try to find some words or whatever about the way in which China is expressing its view to suggest that maybe there's a bit of light between China and Russia, but all its points consistently focus on the same basic issues that Russia has been asserting since December, that the resolution of the crisis is the negotiation of a post-Cold War security arrangement in Europe and the end of, I guess, the unipolar world defined by America. So China has said that they want to de-escalate. They need to have a political settlement, and that needs to be an atmosphere for direct dialogues and negotiations between the parties concerned, which also means direct dialogue between those parties and not with sort of shadow representation by America. Long-term regional peace and security that meets the needs of all parties, and that there's a focus on the principle of indivisible security, which is exactly the same principle that Russia has been asserting against NATO eastward expansion, which means that you can't build up your security at the expense of your neighbour, or the expense of another state, which effectively is what NATO is really doing. The final settlement of the Ukraine crisis requires abandoning the Cold War mentality, abandoning the logic of ensuring one's own security at the expense of others, and the abandoning of the approach of seeking regional security by expanding military blocs, which is a comment on both NATO and indeed on the Australian-UK-US arrangement. So China is definitely not on the NATO side, and that's another billion people. And there has been some speculation that China might indeed get involved as a mediator between Ukraine and Russia, but I've heard that they might have floated that as sort of backing away, partly because they sensed that the United States was kind of playing a bit of a game of using China as a mediator in order to get China to distance itself from Russia. I still think that part of the solution to this crisis will be ultimately Ukraine becoming a neutral state in some form or other, and turning away from Europe, which is about to go into a meltdown, and turning to China for investment in the redevelopment of its economy and infrastructure after the war. But that's just speculation on my part. They'll certainly have to deal with some of the racism in their society in order to successfully do that. So that's China. So China and India, definitely not part of the NATO alliance. Critically also, China is not taking part in the West's financial and economic sanctions on Russia. And as the International Crisis Group recognises, has said it will maintain normal trade and financial ties with both Moscow and Kiev. as sanctions take a toll on the Russian economy, it is possible that Beijing will extend a helping hand, and indeed they already have, though, in terms of credit cards and other matters. They've taken on more gas, they've taken on more trade, and apparently there's quite a popular sort of movement, I guess, like whether consumer-led or social media astroturfed, I'm not really sure. I can't really tell. But, there is some level of people buying Russian goods in China in order to compensate for loss of trade in other areas. Now, the Gulf countries, including the United Arab Emirates, are also an interesting, different example of these, the sort of, I guess, the international chessboard on the new multipolar orders, new multipolar world order. Those countries have been very close US partners, Saudi Arabia, etc., Qatar, etc., etc. But they've also been building their ties with Russia. Russia is actually a major oil exporter and is part of, I think it's called OPEC Plus. So there's a degree of diplomatic collaboration around the sort of supply and production of oil, and also the whole question of security of the Middle East. The dynamic of that has changed quite a lot in recent years, with America generally withdrawing and Russia being effectively the major power that stopped the emergence of ISIS and brought some level of security back to Syria. The Gulf states have, complex relationships between Russia and the United States. And when these issues came up before the UN Security Council, the United Arab Emirates took the same position as India and abstained, and which created some level of heartache in the sort of NATO alliance. They very much were urging restraint, but when so the UN Security Council had several votes, and then it went to the United Nations General Assembly for a general vote on the Ukraine issue. And at that General Assembly, the United Arab Emirates changed its position, and the International Crisis Group, which is pretty much a pro-NATO sort of think tank, consultancy type, sort of troubleshooter consultancy type organisation, does produce and I'm just reading from its analysis of the different perspectives on all of this. It says here that the United States appears to have worked hard to get the Gulf Arab states behind the General Assembly resolution on Ukraine. President Biden reportedly calling at least one government in the region to learn how its delegation would vote, and all backed the text. No Gulf power wants to give the impression of siding with the Kremlin for fear of aggravating the US, their primary security guarantor. But as international support for Ukraine and anger at those seen to support or at least not publicly oppose Russia grows, interesting assumption, the damage may already have been done. The US and its European allies were appalled at the Gulf states' reticence to get in line with immediate condemnations of the Russian invasion. Interesting there. So there's a level of scolding being channeled by or communicated by the International Crisis Group towards the Gulf states for being tardy and recalcitrant in adopting the pro-NATO, pro-American position. That's just three big countries, India, China, and the Gulf states, particularly the United Arab Emirates. Before I leave that, though, I should also say that the other significant thing that happened with the Gulf states is President Biden pressured them to increase oil production, and they refused. As I maybe mentioned earlier on, oil prices are about to go through the roof and drive global inflation. So there's been a lot of theatrics from the various state actors of the United States and NATO, with, people lined up, press conferences and dramatic speeches at the United Nations General Assembly and all that sort of thing. And, really outlandish rhetoric and the revving up of the communications war, the information war against Russia. But it is clear there is not a unified world position against Russia. It's actually quite complicated and quite finessed, and a very significant number of states recognise the fundamental importance of dealing with the end of the Cold War, I guess, as I've said, dealing with the new security architecture of Europe and recognising Russia's legitimate security interests, and also recognising that there was more to this than an unprovoked attack, but that some form of genuine, honest and quiet diplomacy can perhaps lead us out of the crisis, even if it didn't prevent the crisis. Perhaps because the people who mattered most were incapable of conducting that effective, quiet diplomacy. It's a pity that Subramanian Jaishankar is not the Secretary of State for the United States. That's all I'm going to say for today's episode of Geopolitics Upside Down. And I'm going to be back in a couple of days, and I think I might just do a bit of a situation report against the key vectors, because I get the sense that the next couple of days might be pretty crucial in terms of the unfolding of this situation. Okay, bye now. Take care. Stay sane.